For our next section, we're going to start talking about how language and the languages that we use might influence how we go about thinking. So we can start with the linguistic relativity hypothesis. And this hypothesis basically says that language determines what we're capable of thinking. So if this hypothesis were true, the words that we have available to us in our language should actually shape what we are able to perceive in our world. So the biggest example that they'll use to test this theory would be that languages that only have a very small number of words for, say, colors would have a harder time perceiving differences between other colors. So at the extreme example here, the Dani of New Guinea, they only have 2 words for colors. They would describe warm colors and cool colors, and that's it, which is a big difference from in English where we have lots and lots of color words. And so they tested that culture's perceptual ability. Can they tell the difference between different shades, different colors, in the same way that we who speak English can? And to go against this linguistic relativity hypothesis, that culture didn't have any issue telling different colors apart. Just because they didn't have words to describe those colors didn't mean that they perceived them. Now, that finding hasn't always been upheld. Another study looked at another culture, the Himba, and the Himba language only uses 5 color words. And again, English has, for comparison, about 11 basic color words, though we do complicate it some. But the Himba children would divide colors up into fewer groups. So they would have basically 5 categories where they would divide their colors, and they didn't make distinctions between different shades that we would make distinctions between speaking English. So English speakers might group them as all of the blue colors together, all the purples together, all the greens together, and so on. But with these Himba children, they had a group of colors that included blues and greens and browns and purples, because they all fell under that one color term. And so you'll notice between the 2 studies, the first study was looking at their ability to perceive differences, whereas this second one that we're talking about was looking more at how they cluster things together. How do they push things together? And so these are very different tests of perception. So if we take these 2 studies under consideration, though you know now that multiple other studies would be conducted if we're going to talk about it in a class like this. So across lots and lots of research, our current view isn't so much that our language determines our thinking capacity, it's more of an influence. So the way that we can talk about things influences our perception, it influences the way that we think about things, but it isn't a deterministic view. Just because you don't have a word for a color doesn't mean you can't see it, but it will influence how you categorize that color. So our linguistic relativity hypothesis isn't so much a deterministic thing, we can view it as an influence instead. And so what other things might language influence? Maybe it's going to influence how we think, how we categorize, even how much detail we pay attention to. So if you don't want to break your colors down into more refined categories, if you're fine grouping lots together because that all falls under a word in your language, then you wouldn't necessarily pay attention to the fact that blue is different from purple if they both fall in the same category of a language word for color. So again, influencing, not determining. But language can also influence other things in our lives. It can alter what we pay attention to, the decisions that we make, or even the conclusions that we draw as we're looking at or reading or listening to something. And a very interesting example that the textbook uses here is that sexist language can influence our perceptions, decisions, and the conclusions that we draw. So it can illustrate all three of these points. And here, when you see like the phrase sexist language, you assume that it's going to be an experiment looking at sort of offensive or in-your-face sexist language. But in fact, the study just looked at a simple phrase, and the phrase was worded one of two ways. So the first is, the psychologist believes in the dignity and worth of the individual human being. He is committed to increasing man's understanding of himself and others. So that would be a sexist phrase. But if you reworded it as psychologists believe in the dignity and worth of individual human beings, they are committed to increasing people's understanding of themselves and others. That simple change, removing that gendering of the individual, can change our perceptions, decisions, and conclusions. Where people who are asked to read that first sentence, where they only talk about his and man's and mankind, they interpreted psychology as a more male-appropriate field. They would interpret it as something that is a better place for men to be, and if they as a woman wanted to be a psychologist, then maybe they would be out of place. So they would start drawing conclusions that psychology would be male-based just from how that sentence was worded. Whereas people who read the neutral, the non-gendered version of that sentence, they didn't make that same conclusion. They concluded that psychology could be for either sex. And so just the way that information is presented, the language that's used to present that information, can change how we think about things. And it's very subtle changes that make a huge difference. And actually, before I move on to this slide, we can also use one more example about how language influences the way you think about things. And we can use the example of numbers. In English, we have this unfortunate way that our numbering system works. So from 1 to 10, that's fine. But when we move on to 11 and 12, we kind of break with our base 10 system. And what I mean by that is in other languages. So, for example, in numerous Asian languages, the base 10 wording is maintained throughout the whole language. So instead of 11, their word for 11 would translate to 10-1. And then instead of 12, it would be 10-2. And so for children who are exposed to language that frames it as 1 to 10, but repeated over and over again, it makes it easier for them to grasp mathematical concepts. Addition and subtraction becomes easier because at a much younger age, they're able to grasp the fact that our mathematics are set up to have that base of 10. So 1 and 11 are different from each other by 10 numbers. And that's a little bit more clear if you go from 1 to 10-1, as opposed to 11, which just doesn't give that same concept to us. And so you can see this in scores of mathematical ability, especially by age, where English-speaking children take quite a bit longer to grasp that idea of how our numbers are set up. They don't learn it until a couple of years after children from most Asian countries do, which again is really interesting how the way that we speak about things and the way that we conceptualize things is very strongly influenced by the language that we speak or sign or write. And at the very end of this section here, I just wanted to take a brief detour to talk about a question that a lot of people come up with when we start talking about human language. And that is, can non-human animals acquire language? So we could ask, could a chimpanzee acquire language? How about a bonobo? How about a gorilla? So on and so forth. Most of the research into non-human animals being able to acquire language has focused on our closest relatives, the great apes. And so here we have one of the most famous cases of language learning, or the potential for language learning in a non-human species, and this is Kanzi the bonobo, who was taught how to speak-ish using symbols that represented different things. And so the psychologist that worked with Kanzi was Sue Savage-Rumbaugh, and they worked together for about 17 months, mostly looking at shapes and symbols like these, which Kanzi could then point to have different meanings. And so with these symbols, over time, we have a graph depicting how Kanzi actually acquired those symbols. So on the bottom here, we have Kanzi's age in months, so how old she was at different periods, and then how many symbols she knew, how many words she had acquired. And so we see this steady increase where after they had worked together for those 17 months, Kanzi had acquired and could use about 80 different symbols. And with these symbols, Kanzi was able to combine them together and convey some meaning where she could ask for something. So maybe she could dictate how she wanted to play with her handler. And so these combinations had meaning to them. And so if we want to evaluate this in terms of language, we can actually use the different definitions we've talked about in describing our human language. So we described language as being symbolic, structured, conveying meaning, being generative, and permitting displacement. And though I am using Kanzi as a standalone example, there have been numerous studies with different species of great apes trying to do similar things here. So some were using symbols, some were using sign language, and over all of these cases of teaching language to these other species, we seem to have pretty good evidence for the fact that it is symbolic, because clearly we're looking at symbols here for Kanzi to use. We also find that it tends to convey meaning, so Kanzi could ask for something or answer questions about things using those symbols. There was meaning to it. But we see significantly less evidence for things like structure or generativity or displacement. And so that kind of leads us to our overall conclusion about animals acquiring language, that it's not necessarily as clear-cut as it is with human language. So some things to consider here are that a lot of these cases are looking at these great apes' ability to acquire specifically human language. Can they communicate with humans? So the question's a little bit different than maybe what we would want to ask. So you could also ask about communication within a species. So how do apes communicate with other apes? Is their own communication something similar to language? And that's even more of a gray area. So with language acquisition and getting out of humans, there's a lot of disagreement. There's a lot of arguments within the field. But most of them will agree that of the species that we've studied so far, and as much as we've found very interesting methods of communication and lots of information being shared between different individuals, no other species seems to have a method of communication that ticks all the boxes that we're looking for when we look at human language. So we will leave it as language acquisition in animals doesn't happen the same way it happens in humans, and most linguists will not call animal communication language because it doesn't meet the criteria that we use in humans. And from that very careful wording, I'm sure you can tell that it's a very controversial subject as someone who studies communication in songbirds. You don't want to imply that it's language because people don't like that. And on that a little bit amusing note, we'll leave this section here.